Well, there is a relationship between the jhanas and the Paticca Samuppada in the following way. That first off, we know that in order to understand the teachings of the Buddha, including Paticca Samuppada, we need First Jhana, so we're already off in that direction. Okay? Now, the next point that we begin to look at is that we practice Paticca Samuppada in reverse order, though it's being taught in forward order. This is the whole idea of forward and backward. Is because it makes a whole lot of sense to us that this causes that, this causes that, this causes that. But then the other way of looking at it would be when we understand that, then we can also see that, oh, this is caused by that. But that in turn was caused by this over thing over here. And that then in turn was caused by that. All right. That's basically then through that progression is first off intellectual, but then later it becomes experiential. As our Sati gets faster and faster, as we begin to, in our ability to investigate, we begin to catch up with how fast the mind is actually working.
And isn't it the point then where you're able to like feel and experience without the craving and the clinging? That's the working backwards, and that's when you have this like wholesome joy and absorption. Like that's
okay. Yes. So let's investigate that just a little bit. When people are arguing, sometime or another they're going to stop. Generally, they do stop when one or the other of them, and it may be a third party who comes in and interrupts them, that says, hey, the direction that this is going is not right. In other words, once you're into dukkha, but you're also building it up, that somehow or another we get woke up, and then we stop. An example of that would be either the husband and the wife storming out of the room and slamming the door, because that's a better thing to do than to continue to argue and fight. All right, I've had enough of this, and so we quit. That's a way of looking at that argument like this, and we do this. But it's a letting go. You turn loose of the thing. Even though we have to do it with an exclamation point as we slam the door. But that's pretty late in the game. But as we begin to meditate, we begin to understand that the source of this anger actually is kicked off by a feeling of not liking. And that feeling of not liking then gets stirred back into the pot, so that it keeps coming up with more and more, I don't like this and I've got to do something about it. So that's when the clinging happens, is when the argument starts, but it already had the feeling of I don't like it. So now we're beginning to pick up, it's not that we're beginning to see how attached we are right now, we begin to see how attached I'm about to get. And then we begin to see, oh, the whole point of me going in that direction of getting that way was because I don't like it. I don't like what happened. I don't like that she spent $50 at the grocery store, or whatever generation you're in. So that this whole point then is where Bhikkhu Buddhadasa says this is really the right place for students to start. And that is mindfulness at the point of contact. Mindfulness at the point of contact. In other words, when that visual image, or when our version of the reality of the moment strikes us, then we have a feeling about it. And that feeling, if it's a wise feeling, we can manage the feelings at that point. In fact, we begin to practice doing that without knowing that we're already practicing Paticca Samuppada when we start to develop piti and sukha. in Sati that were already at that level. So later we began then to see, oh, I don't like how I feel right now, because how I feel is I don't like something. And we can say, wait a minute, I don't have to feel that way. I can change the feelings because I've been practicing changing the feelings all along. And so this is kind of that midpoint, or actually the starting point of how we come out of suffering, is because we begin to manage the way that we feel. Okay? Well, guess what? Managing the way we feel is basically what Second Jhana is all about, though most people get involved with, oh, Second Jhana is all about stop thinking. But a much better way of looking at it is that, no, the mind is quiet of thinking long enough to begin to see that turmoil of feelings that we have, so that we begin to manipulate them. Because by the time we had gone thoughtless, we were already working with piti and sukha. Therefore, our job in Second Jhana is to really to get that stuff going. And so in the Second Jhana, which now we're talking about in relationship to Paticca Samuppada, backing down into the feelings, that we're now at that level of feeling where we can begin to control these feelings. And the control of these feelings then means that we begin to manage them by, first off, becoming overwhelmed with them. The analogy that the Buddha uses for the Second Jhana is the artesian well, or what is commonly called a spring. Now, if you dam up that spring, especially if it's a fast-flowing stream or spring, then if you build a dam around it, it'll grow a pond, but down at the bottom of that pond will always be extra cold water that's coming right out of the ground. Often no air bubbles are there, but still that whirl of the change in the temperature of the water, the kids really love to do that. It's a really remarkable thing. It's kind of funny like that, because we actually had such a pond at one of the places that I lived for about a year. And so for about a year, I was one of the kids that really loved to go into that pond to dive down to that artesian. It only happened for part of the year, but it was on the side of a hill. And so after it rained, that was the time to go, because it was especially good right after a rain. And that pond actually would get full up from the bottom up, because the big hill that was above it was where all that water was coming from. So, but into that, it swirls and it boils and it bubbles, and it's just so exciting. It's really, really kind of like a roller coaster, especially if you want to lay flat, because it wants to twist you into the knots and that kind of thing. So this is an experience that's had. The Buddha actually talks about this, assuming that everyone in his area has gone to that artesian well and knows exactly what we're talking about, in the sense now that we are kind of free from thoughts, now the feelings just bubble up and overflow, and we feel so tingly, alive, and good. In fact, in the Visuddhimagga, they actually list them in order and give a description, including the kind of description of just hair on the back of your neck, or the hair on your arms will stand up, or tingling sensations, and sometimes like you got hit by an ocean wave. You just come in and go, boom, and then you're in that. So that's another example, would be out in the ocean and being hit by a wave and just turned and all over the place. You know you're going to make it back to the surface, but this is an interesting experience in the moment. Okay. So this is where we can begin to operate through that to the actual Second Jhana, but we can understand at the First Jhana level that these raptures and feelings that I have are controllable. But as we then go deeper into Paticca Samuppada, now we begin to look at calming these feelings down anyway. And this then is the analogy of the lotus, that even though the lotus can be in a rushing spring, though most people think of it as in mud, when it rises out of the mud, it's free from any muck or filth, but it's also free of water. So even if it's in a fast-flowing brook, when it comes up, it's dry. So this is the quality then of the third jhana, is the being able to rise up and put these feelings to their place so that they also become empty.
Yeah, I can relate a lot to this, actually. For me, it feels like it doesn't feel like rising above them, though. It feels like sinking below them. There's something like, as you move through the piti and you move through the sukha, and the thoughts start to quiet, and you're in that place where it's just you and these feelings, what you're describing as second jhana, it kind of gets to a point where you just go, and you just kind of like drop below it, and there's like this stillness below those feelings. It's interesting, like above and below are obviously completely metaphorical in this sense, but for some reason...
Okay, now that you recognize that, but there is, we could use the word beyond, and that doesn't necessarily in what direction, or even going so far as to settling in, just to settling in. So now that we have, let's look at it a bit so far in the sense of neuroscience. The first part that we're doing is the wake-up call of getting the frontal cortex really in functioning operation. Getting the frontal cortex, getting the human quality of the mind going. Getting the supercomputer cranked up, software loaded, ready to go, and now we're watching what's going on. That's the whole idea about the first jhana. Throw the junk out also. Do some house cleaning, get the hindrances out, get that piti sukha going.
It's interesting as well, like you talk about the very human part of the supercomputer, but it's also, for me, the experience of first jhana is like so embodied. It's so to do with having, like the joy starts flooding when I am really in touch with the whole body breathing. Like that's the kind of gateway for the joy. Yeah.
Right. So the serotonin and dopamine certainly play the parts in there.
Yeah.
So basically, to make sure that the mind is not dull and that it's not hindered in any way and that it's not in desire. And in fact, what the primary and most important one is that because we're so satisfied, there's no fear here now. Now, the source of the feelings should be free from the base, which is the fear that gives rise to the feelings. But if we're already in a state of fearlessness in this moment, not totally, but at least right now, we're free from it. Free from the fears then allows us to begin to manipulate the feelings, because the rascal that normally controls that is the reptilian part of the mind that's reacting by doing its job of self-preservation instinct. And that's the way that it rings your bell, is by fear, the chemicals of fear. So when we're free from that fear, now we can begin, and that starts right there in First Jhana. That's when we can begin to bring these good feelings up, which also has the quality of the removing of the doubt. Because if the student says, I don't know whether I can feel good or not, he's actually stopping himself from doing that. And part of that might be that he needs to give himself permission to do this, because we can be carrying a lot of baggage. Like Mommy says, for instance, stop playing with that wheelbarrow. You don't know nothing about machinery. But that's a Southern joke. And so we get inhibited that we're not supposed to feel really good or that we have the freedom to investigate or whatever, that we still get caught in that do what you're told to do mentality. And even Buddha himself was a bit confused and was able to pull apart the distinction between what's referred to as sensual pleasures and these pleasures that we can create in the mind, and we could even go so far as mention sexual pleasures. And so these sensual pleasures that we keep looking for is actually we look for them in the outside world. But by turning within and looking for the pleasures of being able to just manage and control our own feelings, then leaves off that quality of it. So that now this rapture in piti is actually quite valuable, because this actually is the stuff that we were looking for anyway when we were out in the world trying to find it through, let's say, the back entrance to the brothel or whatever. So the first thing then is to shut down the frontal, the first thing is to rid the mind of thoughts so that we begin to control the thoughts with the front part of the mind, because normally the thinking part of the mind, which is associated with sound and hearing and is actually more of a primitive, and we could go so far as to call it mammalian. The mammalian brain is the talking brain. It's the way that we relate. That's where we get all of our secondary stuff, including, you could go so far as to say rites, rules, and rituals, all of our belief systems and concepts and everything that's there. A lot of that stuff monkeys do. Monkeys got language. And dogs have language. They just don't have the vocal cords to spread it. So when we begin then to go into the jhanas, then by concentrating really on the feelings, and there's many ways to do it, the mind at that level gets quiet, in the sense that now we've got just the frontal cortex, or the human part of the brain, and the reptilian brain in operation. And here that reptilian brain is just going bing, 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 like that, with the feeling. So the third jhana then is to be able to calm that stuff down so that we can rise above it and leave it down into the background. Okay, so as we're doing this, then we're also beginning to shut down the salayatana, because a lot of that internal language was going on at the level of salayatana, which was the internal, and so a lot of our internal is actually words that we have learned and keep repeating ourselves over and over again. So what we're actually doing now is to shut down the salayatana. So we're stepping back now in Paticca Samuppada. All right. When we get down to the point that the breathing is very, very light and shallow and still, the frontal cortex is in full operation, is when we can begin to shut the feelings down, because we're shutting down the part of the mind that creates the feelings, the salayatana. We're quietening also the visual. So we can't talk to ourselves into being unhappy. We can't think our way or see our way into unhappy. And all we've got is kind of a really easygoing place that the Buddha would refer to as a pleasant abiding. Now we're getting right down to the whole quality of perception itself. So that as we begin to see how we perceive things, we begin to understand that how we perceive things is through sensual orientation, that the eye or the ear or something will happen, and then the perception will pick up on it. But if we can bring it down to the point that the seeing is merely the seen, and the herd is merely the herd, that means that no longer we're processing. Now the Namarupa is no longer grab bagging stuff out of the Sankara to try to paint a middle picture, because we're now peaceful enough that that stuff is beginning to slow down and stop.
So is this when we're dealing with the aggregate of consciousness rather than perception, because there's just that's what's seen, there's just what's heard, there's just what's felt, and there's no narrativizing or linguistic understanding around it?
Just almost direct experience. Almost direct experience, kind of for the first time in our life, because normally we do not allow direct experience. We always want filtered experience. Because there may be something dangerous, and we've got to filter everything. And what I mean by filtering it means to process it or perceive it.
But it's also that self, isn't it? It's also that it's that self that does it. So when the self is calmed to the extent, because all of that thinking is a big way that self manifests, and when that was all quiet and there's only that consciousness, there's only that when there's only that consciousness, that self, sorry, I got completely thrown there by someone phoning me, the self kind of disappears or drops off, and you don't need to be going into the memory banks to contextualize this moment in the history of yourself. You can just be in that moment. Yeah.
Be here now, literally. Now we're really getting into the be here now, down at a very deep level. We're in the beginning of it. We were still telling ourselves all about it. And we wanted to use that. That was, first off, the telling ourselves all about it was applied in direct thought, which means that finally we were taking charge. That before, whatever was the input was just getting haphazardly mixed in with whatever was there, coming up with good old whatever out of the habit of the mind. So this is actually a process of refinement. So getting then down into the area or the purview of the Forth Jhana, there's several aspects to it. The analogy that the Buddha uses is the analogy of imagine that you were covered completely with a white sheet, a shimmering white sheet. What that means is that our proprioceptive system has begun to break down, in the sense that now we are beginning to expand. That we don't see ourselves in the proprioceptive feeling system. It begins to expand. This is what gives rise to, and I've got to take a moment for an advertisement here. The word is in the sutta translated into English as infinite space. That's completely wrong, because the word infinite is not the right word. In fact, infinite it doesn't exist anywhere in the real world. No matter how far out you go or how big your numbers get, it's still a number. The concept of infinite comes from mathematics, division by zero, and it can be very, very handy, just like imaginary numbers. Very, very handy, but it generally falls back out of the equation. It's just kind of a way of looking at things intermediately, but has no real ultimate value to it. So you can think of it as a trick. Never mind that what we're actually talking about in the Fourth Jhana is more of a boundless that's very, very close to the boundary. In other words, the boundary gets fuzzy, but it doesn't make it infinite. It just makes it fuzzy, a fuzzy boundary, so that it's hard to detect where the body ends and where space begins. This is why people have sensations of flying. They have sensations of growing very, very tall, 60 feet tall, and whatnot like that. And that's also the reason for the touch of the earth mudra. Without opening the eyes, to pull the one out of the fourth jhana, they can merely just touch the ground, because that's proof enough that I'm still on the ground.
It's interesting, actually, in like a lot of the yoga literature, they talk about like powers of growing as big as a mountain or shrinking as small as a grain of rice. Like Hanuman, who's considered sort of tied in with the yoga tradition quite deeply, is what some of his powers are like, to become as big as a mountain or become as small as a grain of sand.
Yes, but these are powers of the mind, for the mind, and of the mind, and to think so otherwise is magical thinking.
Yes, of course.
It's got to be expressed somehow.
Or metaphorical thinking. I quite like I like those myths. I like reading my children those myths. It's sort of poetic and mythic without necessarily having to believe in it like a magic.
Exactly.
Yeah. See, I find the descriptions of third jhana very relatable. I feel like that's a point that I get to quite a lot. Then there's a point there where and I relate this back to kind of the steps of Anapanasati. It's like that third jhana seems like a place where you're kind of in a very bare way experiencing the mind, because you're experiencing that space free from the salayatana, free from mental talk, free from mental imagery, and you're just kind of experiencing it as this space, and it's very still and it's very clear and quite a beautiful experience. And then a little part of my brain kicks in and goes, and what's the next step of Anapanasati? And it goes gladdening the mind. And then with that, there's like this little letting go, and there's like this a kind of joy floods back in, and I'm kind of back in with that feeling. And then the joy sometimes powers a feeling of physical expansion. And so that, I've just wondered though, but that can't be the expansion of fourth jhana, can it? Because it feels like it's powered by a kind of emotional rising.
Right. This is exactly correct. And here's what's really going on, that the experience for the first few times of second jhana and for the first few times of third jhana, is so almost exhilarating or such a surprise that we go yippee-ki-yo-ki-yay, or we start talking to ourselves again because that's the very nature of the mind, is to try to make sense out of it. And so we come out of the jhana in order to tell ourselves a story. But we can do that and then go right back into it if we're gaining skill. And then the middle point will be when you can go into the third jhana and then at least stay in it without having to tell yourself that you're in it, or that you've got a story about how you got there, or how marvelous and what a good Dhamma dude you are because you can do this now, or any of those other kind of thoughts that come. And so once we're able to maintain that third jhana, it almost, not automatically, but let's say it will melt into the fourth jhana with the right imagery would be shimmering white, that everything becomes shimmering white. And that could be just looking through your eyes to see what's there behind without there being anything to see. In other words, what we're doing is that we're turning off the part of the mind that does the visualization, like we have already previously turned off the talking mind. So that now things become either uniform in color, but that color is either, it's kind of a shimmering color, but some people would say it's black and others would say it's white or whatever like that. It's not exactly like everybody for himself, and is more of the description of it. But the important thing is now we're no longer making mental imagery.
I can relate to that. There gets to a point in the third jhana where it's still, and suddenly you become very aware of. For me, it's like I refer to it as like in my mind as like a black luminosity. It somehow like both partakes of black and luminousness.
I will black luminosity and white shimmering but the Buddha uses white shimmering, that you can see that relationship, because basically what's going on is the shutting down of the part of the brain that does visualization, so that we're systematically closing down these senses. And that's what gives rise also to the closing down to the senses of the body, is where we begin to lose the boundaries of the body, because we're beginning to shut it down. This is why we have those feelings of flying through the air or being very, very large or whatever like that. So we're shutting down the visual, we're shutting down now the body, and we've already previously shut down the hearing part of it. Olfactory and taste is generally not part of the equation in general anyway.
Yeah, you're not chewing gum while you're meditating. It'd be a funny sight in a Dharma hall somewhere, some young monk sort of chewing. Anyway.
Or a Tic Tac for that matter.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're also not in the mouth, but we've basically coming out of the body. And so this is then what gives rise to, beside infinite space, or the body loses its combination. We also begin to separate and remove consciousness from perception, because those things are normally so rooted tightly together that it's almost never that we see things as they really are without perceiving them also. So now we're getting down to the point that we say that, okay, the only thing that we're actually going to perceive is consciousness itself, because we've already shut down most of the senses. So now we're going to get in touch with what consciousness is, and what it seems like in the beginning is something that's constantly vibrating. Then we recognize, no, it's something that's actually going on and off and on and off, and it's having trouble because it doesn't find something to kick it. An example of that is that real consciousness is when the eye has an object to be seen. And when that object and the eye connect together, that's seeing. Well, right now we're not able to see anything, but we have that consciousness also. And so what we begin to recognize is that perception is also in limbo. So it becomes neither perception nor non-perception. Now, the Visuddhimagga describes this as, imagine a clay bowl that has had oil in it, but the oil has been taken out, maybe even scrubbed out, yet there is still oil in that clay bowl. If you wave your finger around it, you can actually pick up a little oil, and yet there's nothing really there. This is what, in the sense of pouring it out or using it for cooking or doing anything, there's no oil. And yet it is not completely empty of oil.
Yeah.
And so they call it neither perception nor non-perception. It's neither oil nor not oil. But this perception point is in fact closely tied to the fact that consciousness now is loose. And the perception is only that we can see this consciousness there that's been turned loose. There's no longer got any boundaries to it.
So that,
the boundary being the eye or the ear or whatever like that. And so then the next part is that without this combination of consciousness having an object that then can be processed, is basically all there is to the mind. And without doing that, we come to that state of nothing. And so now the abider will just sit in that state of emptiness. There's nothing there because we're not perceiving, we're not doing any input. We've just got this sort of massive computer that's going on, chugging along without any resistance to it now. And so
because it's not attaching to anything. The consciousness is not attaching to any of the sense. So it's like unmoored space of consciousness, not contracting around something.
Exactly, not bound. And that not bound is misunderstood when it's translated as infinite. Really leads students astray. What we're really talking about, and Ajahn Thanissaro is quite right when he talks about that, mind like fire, unbound. But he's actually talking about this quality of that the mind becomes unbound to the sense object or to the salayatana. Now, these states are Fourth Jhana that are very, very difficult for students to get into if they're kind of finding their way into it with not very good instructions. But if we really understand what's going on here, because we've studied, we've watched it, and we can see it in the First Jhana, we can actually then talk ourselves literally into the Fourth Jhana. But here we call it the Vipassana Jhana because it's so much easier to do. It's just literally you just go, just really go into hangout mode. And so this is not part of the path or the result of the path, because one does not need to do that in order to solve dukkha. In other words, we don't have to go right to the bottom of the barrel. We only need to go just so far into it so that we have really excellent control of the feelings. So that we
you're saying going into Fourth Jhana is not necessary for the path of dukkha, nirodha. Yeah.
No, but it's a lot of fun when you got nothing else to do.
Well, it's such interesting terrain. I found the last 20 minutes of talking just so interesting, because it's so interesting how one's own subjective experience of the mind, when as you say, when it starts to when the sense, I'm relating to what you're saying about the sense consciousness shutting down and that kind of like black luminosity we're describing, like it's such subtle and interesting terrain, and it's just so interesting hearing you describe it and it's just sort of relating that to what's going on in my sits. But every time before I speak to you, I always sit for 40 minutes, an hour, so it's like really fresh in my mind.
Okay. Now here's something quite amazing, and I think any advanced meditation teacher will say this, and that is that students, without knowing what they're doing, go in and out of these states, sometimes very quickly. They go into that state, and then they come back out. In fact, you could go so far even to say that ordinary people go into those states momentarily and then come back out. And Bhikkhu Buddhadasa would say that we can call those little Nibannas. And that if people didn't have little Nibannas, they'd burn their mind up. That we need that kind of rest from time to time. It's just shut off. But that shut off is like only momentary to just clean things out. You could in some cases you could call it a senior moment, where the mind just goes, the word just doesn't come. It's just, sorry, we're out to lunch right now.
I suppose you're saying with meditation, those moments, you become conscious of those moments, whereas and
you begin to like them too. You begin to really like that you can turn that thing off and get down to a very, very deep, basic part of the mind, because we're no longer being controlled by that reptilian part of the brain that has been the boss in keeping us alive our whole lives.
So what's the relationship between that and Nibbana then? Is the idea that when you are kind of in Fourth Jhana?
The answer would be in the relationship of how cool is cool. When is a little Nibbana no longer little? Well, we have to start with the little Nibbanas to begin to figure out what they are, begin to see them, begin to understand that we can put ourselves into these really nice, pleasant states where everything is just really shut down. And that it's actually refreshing so that we can begin to enjoy these states. But they begin to linger, they begin to build up as our skill develops to keep them going. Because otherwise, what happens is we're in and out, and we're in and out. And then we begin to recognize it because we've gotten such a sharp mind through meditation that when we go in, we recognize it and go in and out, but we still can't control it yet, but at least we can begin to see it. And then eventually when we go in, we can say, wait a minute, I see you in there. Let's slow this thing down a bit. And so that's how you begin to, it's actually the same process as the beginning of Anapanasati. It's just one process.
Just operating at a subtler level.
Right, except that we're operating with higher levels of skill, and so we're operating at a deeper level.
And I suppose maybe similarly then it's like you bring it back into your daily life and you normalize it as far as reasonable, in the same way that I feel like that's the process I've undergone a lot in the last, especially sort of like when first hanging out in First Jhana, and then, which is now 6 months ago, and then just kind of bringing that feeling into as many moments in the day as possible, remembering what it's like to feel joy in the body and allowing it to be there. Is it the same then with Fourth Jhana and that coolness? It's like familiarizing yourself with it to the point that you can then invite it in the rest of, when you remember to, in the rest of life.
Exactly so. Or, it's a little bit difficult to talk about because it's so much easier to go into that state when you're sort of just hanging out anyway, or you're already practicing anyway. But being able to go into that state while you're driving a car, not recommended. And in fact, it's way too difficult to do. I've heard students actually talk about that. And they said, I was driving and I fell into Forth Jhana. And I wrote back to him, it was one of these boards. I said, if I was a cop, I'd bust you for DWJ. And that I hope you learn your lesson and start watching where you're going and start having your mind wander off into places where it doesn't belong, because that's dangerous. Okay. Generally, the idea is that one can go into second jhana during walking meditation, but that it's difficult to go any further. That only in the lying posture or in the sitting posture can one go into the deeper jhanas, because the body has to be completely still, especially for the fourth jhana. That's why breathing is very soft, that the whole being is covered in a shivering thing, so that the body and you can see in that regard that what's happening is that though the reptilian brain is not shutting down, it's at least going into a very, very relaxed state, so that the feelings are no longer arising, and that the breath becomes very subtle. The heart, I would say that in fact blood pressure goes quite low. And one goes into a state of kind of a homeostasis. It's really, really homeostasis in the sense that it's extraordinarily pleasant, very pleasant But it takes some practice to maintain it because there's so many different things that can pull you out of it. Like recognizing that you're there. I did it. And where to go, And so it takes some skill development to maintain it. But the other point is that you've got a life to live. You don't need to spend all of your time doing this when you've got other things that are just as pleasant to be done. That the Fourth Jhana and that kind of stuff would really be for cave dwellers or guys who really have had it up to here with society and would rather be off alone. And so now they've got the time to do nothing, literally, because that's about as nothing as you can get to. It's the nothingness of the Fourth Jhana. In fact, when you can see it from that metaphor, you can begin to understand what how complex this whole concept of sunyata is, about how many layers or levels of emptiness is there. So the Fourth Jhana then would be like the second jhana in the sense of turning off the thoughts or turning off the verbal. And then it's also like the third in the sense that the third jhana is turning off the feelings. Now in the Fourth Jhana, we're kind of turning off everything, which means now consciousness has no tickler. It has no trigger to pull it off. It becomes free of being controlled by the senses because they're all more or less shut down. That gives rise to, well, what the heck is perception if consciousness has no object? And so this is where that level of Paticca Samuppada then really connects very strongly with the jhanas. But it also, by understanding this from the conceptual level or seeing, really understanding it by seeing it directly in the first jhana, that's all that's really necessary. One way of saying it, in fact, is that in the first jhana, we can actually see what's going on. We can see the mind doing this stuff. And we don't have to bring it to a complete stop. We don't have to slow it down that much. In other words, we can go down to slow motion and still see what's going on. We don't have to go it down to the point of just a photograph in just one frame or whatever like that. We don't have.
Yeah, you can see yourself being pulled out of satisfaction by specific thoughts, and you can let go of those thoughts and come back to satisfaction, even with thoughts going on. Yeah, yes. I see what you're saying.
But then the other way of saying it, actually getting into Fourth Jhana is almost metaphorically like a slap in the face. Wake up! This is who you are. You are consciousness, you are perception, you are this sequence of events that gives rise to an image in your mind of what you thought was real. But it's not, it's just your own invention. You're always watching a television, and you're never out there where the camera is. That's not possible for you to do. Okay, and so that's how we begin to understand, oh, this is the nature of the human being. I can see what's going on now. And it's not I that sees what's going on, but it's something.
It's quite similar to my feeling. I don't know. It's like seeing at the end, like towards the kind of like fourth tetrad end of the sit. What I tend to do is just like, but there are thoughts going on, so it's definitely not. It's like I allow myself to come out of the like absolute stillness of the third jhana, where there's really no mental talk. I see the kind of like black luminosity, and I just allow myself to get like settled into, and I like conceptualize it as emptiness because there's nothing there. But this isn't fourth jhana though, because then what happens is something will pull me out of this, just this like this beingness, and the black luminosity is like the field within which the beingness happens, and it's lovely. And then something will come along, some thought, and it will just pull me out, and I'll go, oh.
Right, you go out.
But that, for me, that's like the insight. It's not that the thing that pulled me out isn't a bad thing. The thing that pulls me out, that I then let go of, it feels like that is a muscle that I am developing, the ability to see selfing occur, to see it as dukkha, and to let it go. And then I tend to have a wave of joy through the body, and then that passes and I settle back into the black luminous, and repeat.
That's actually the cycle until, we've covered it about applied and sustained thought so that we can sustain that level at first jhana. That whole property then is up at that higher level when you're in a higher jhana, is how can you maintain this? Because you're going to, anything that would pull you out is probably going to pull you out of that. And so it's only bigger things that can pull you out in the first jhana. But very, very tiny little subtle things can pull us jhana. Don't even see it until there it goes. Okay, and so that means that we need to develop even a higher level of being on guard. And even a higher level of wakefulness, of watching.
So it's really watching that black luminousness with a really... I can imagine applying what you're saying. I can see what that would look like. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that this is actually a good place. I mean, I can't think of anything really else.
We've arrived at nothing. There's nowhere to go.
And now that
we just need to hang up now. Destination nowhere.
But I've delivered the goods.
Yeah.
And that's the good part.
All right.
Well, we'll see you then. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.
Go play. You got
I will.
ways to look at your toys. Okay.
Thank you, Dhammarato. Take care.